What if your deepest truths couldn't be proven, only felt? Imagine sensing things before they happen, seeing meaning where others see nothing, and living in a world shaped by symbols no one else can see. For the introverted intuitive, this isn't fantasy, it's daily life. But what happens when the world refuses to believe you, when visions go unexpressed and start to consume you from within? Carl Jung warned, without integration this rare gift can become a curse. This is the story of a psyche walking the edge between revelation and madness. The hardest to comprehend by oneself and by others. It is not oriented toward external action, the world of facts or observable emotions. Rather, it is linked to a symbolic flow that arises from the unconscious, guided by inner images, premonitions, and archetypal structures that defy common perception. This kind doesn't follow empirical observations or linear logic. The concrete world, with its pragmatic demands and rational codes, frequently appears banal or irrelevant to it. Not because it is conceited or uninterested, but rather because its attention is focused on another dimension, a symbolic plane that frequently anticipates the present time for it. Its internal compass records meanings that are not yet formed, perceives psychic movements before they become conscious, and is guided by a deep sensitivity to the invisible. The intuitive introvert is sensitive to cultural, spiritual, and existential changes that manifest themselves before they become apparent. But this sensitivity, no matter how strong, has a cost, because the world around it does not function on the same level as the facts. Jung defined this type as someone who sees what is about to be but is not yet. It is a perception oriented towards potential, towards the psychic virtue, towards what is forming in the collective unconscious. Regularity. There is a gap between what this type sees inside and what the outside world expects of it, since society requires proof results and objective data. And what this type observes is intangible by nature, at least initially. It is the type of person who senses something fundamental about someone they have just met, who senses outcomes long before the facts are confirmed, and who feels rifts in the air before events occur. But when it tries to communicate this, it almost always encounters silence or rejection. Over time, it learns to keep quiet in order to keep its inner world a private and impenetrable space, and it is precisely in this silence that the true danger begins. Its perceptions are frequently mocked, ignored, or pathized. Jung made it obvious that this kind runs the risk of becoming absorbed by them if it cannot find a means to transform its ideas into language, art, or tangible action. The inner world, which should be a place of revelation, becomes a prison when symbolic images are not integrated into consciousness and begin to dominate the mind with their own power. The subject is absorbed by the thought process and no longer thinks, pictures. This is where Jung's dire warning begins to materialize. The journey of the intuitive introvert is not easy, but it is also not trivial. It is a journey between worlds, and understanding this crossing can illuminate not only those who live this psychic configuration, but also those who wish to comprehend the deeper mysteries of the human soul in Jung's typological system. If the gift of deep intuition is not balanced, it can turn into a process of dissociation. In this video, we will examine this trajectory in detail, understanding how this type functions, what its specific dangers are, and most importantly, what transformative potential it carries when it finds a path of expression and integration. Unlike extroverted intuition, which looks for possibilities in the outside world, introverted intuition turns inward to the depths of the unconscious and captures not what is visible, but rather what emerges from the more archaic and symbolic layers of the psyche, frequently without warning context or immediate explanation. Intuition is thought to be one of the irrational functions of the psyche, a form of perception that does not rely on logic or sensory experience. This function, according to Jung, is the capacity to see unprocessed psychic images. The introverted, intuitive type lives in constant contact with symbolic forms that have not yet been translated into thought, feeling, or action. They do not see with the eyes of the body, but with the eyes of the soul. What appears to be an ordinary situation to others may have hidden meanings. Their mind functions like an inward-pointing antenna, picking up signals that lack words but have weight, form, and psychic energy. They experience invisible tensions and patterns that recur silently. When combined, this sensitivity is a potent source of understanding, since the sensation function that keeps one in touch with the present, and the body is frequently the most underdeveloped in this type. The introverted intuitive is susceptible to internal dispersion. On the one hand, this sensitivity allows them to perceive the profound meaning of events, comprehend the unconscious motivations of others, and predict changes before they become noticeable. After that, intuition starts to operate independently of real-world experience, and the person becomes engrossed in a sea of inner imagery. Although its internal structure is not chaotic, it is nonetheless uncontrollable. For the introverted intuitive, understanding the workings of their own intuition is the first step to not being enslaved by it. They must learn to distinguish what is a revealing symbol from what is baseless fantasy, which requires time, silence, and internal structure. But it also demands a warning that no matter how fascinating this internal world may be, it holds traps. Symbolic images arise out of psychic necessity rather than conscious choice. When well directed, these visions can become seeds of creation ideas that transform symbols, that heal narratives, that reveal. However, if they are not understood and processed, they can accumulate as psychic noise, causing confusion, paralysis, and the collapse of rational function. The movie will directly address these traps in the following section, particularly the point at which symbolic vision that lacks expression starts to turn into hallucination. Please click the subscribe button to join the channel if this content makes sense to you. We appreciate your support. An aspect of introverted intuition that makes it both fascinating and frightening is that it does not function in the present. Rather, its nature is focused on the future and the unknowable, but it insinuates itself at the boundaries of consciousness. This ability to anticipate makes the introverted intuitive type, in Jung's words, like a prophet who sees what others cannot yet see. However, there is a fundamental problem with this position. What is seen cannot be proven. The introverted intuitive type lives as if inhabiting the threshold between now and not yet. They sense the approach of events and perceive archetypal changes in the psychic and cultural fabric before they manifest in concrete form. What is intuitive rarely resonates with others, and what is felt cannot be supported by facts. This leads to an ongoing struggle between the absence of external acknowledgement and the inner clarity of perception. The tension between the perceived, invisible, and the denied visible starts to erode the psyche of the introverted intuitive when they start to doubt themselves or retreat within their perception with such a strong conviction that they reject the world around them. One of the most potent examples given by Jung is the case of a patient who told of a black snake becoming lodged in her abdomen during the analytical process. As the treatment went on, the snake rose inside her body until it came out of her mouth and changed into a golden-headed serpent. For many, this would seem like a hallucinogenic dream, But according to Jung, the image was a clear symbol of inner transformation, a process of individualization taking visual form through the unconscious. The black snake stood for the repressed, content that, when integrated, was reborn as a symbol of healing. This example perfectly captures how introverted intuition works. It employs pictures rather than reasoning to disclose rather than pointing to reasons. Destinies. Once the vision becomes revealing, it starts to close in on itself, and the mind loses the capacity to discern between what is insight and what is illusion and what was. The issue occurs when these images fail to find an external language, when the symbol is not translated into creation, reflection, or action. Symbolic knowledge turns into isolated mania. The introverted intuitive travels on the very thin line between revelation and delirium every day. To prevent intuition from becoming a psychic maze, it is crucial to comprehend the mechanisms that can cause a break with reality. We will examine this procedure in more detail in the following section. When the symbol, which cannot be articulated, takes over the topic entirely, resulting in archetypal inflation and the loss of reality. The intuitive introverted type is by nature a solitary individual, not because they choose to be so, but because of their psychic makeup. Their focus is on the invisible, on what has not yet materialized, on what arises from the unconscious in symbols, visions, and prophecies. However, when this inner orientation fails to find a way to express itself or mediate with the outside world, it can lead to identity crises and, in more severe cases, grandiose delusions. Jung dubbed this process inflatio, which occurs when the ego is inflated by unconscious contents and starts to identify with powerful archetypes without realizing its boundaries. When an intuitive introverted person notices subtle symbolic patterns, they may start to feel as though they have been selected for a special task. Although at first justified as a reflection of their sensitivity, this sense of individuality can turn into a messianic hallucination when the person begins to perceive themselves as a prophet rejected by a blind society, an unacknowledged visionary, or a bearer of ultimate truths. Isolation grows not as a result, but rather as an explanation that no one comprehends me since I am more developed. Criticism from others is construed as persecution, and doubt is perceived as an indication of others' inadequacy. This kind of psychic inflation is risky, since it eliminates self-criticism. The person starts to live inside their own symbolic story, failing to distinguish between concrete reality and archetypal content. They lose touch with their everyday humanity as they identify with figures from the unconscious, such as the prophet, the wise one, or the martyr. This excessive association with archetypes causes psychological disarray. When the intuitive function that formerly provided glimmers of meaning turns into a means of escape, connections become purely instrumental. Every discrepancy is dismissed as a danger to the inner vision, and practical life is neglected. Jung noted that this pattern was typical of people who emotionally distanced themselves from the outside world and opposed any kind of adjustment. The bigger threat, in his opinion, was not the isolation per se, but rather the unconscious's eventual total takeover of consciousness, at which point the ego stops mediating reality and only functions as a passive container for symbolic images. Perception is warped, judgment is tainted, and life starts to unfold in a faintly hallucinogenic dream world, where nothing is grounded in reality, and not every interaction with the symbol results in collapse. When the symbolic vision finds a way to leave the private realm and appear in the outside world, it transforms from prison into creation. In the following section, we will see exactly how intuitive figures like Kafka, Van Gogh, and Jung himself transformed their internal perceptions into works that altered collective consciousness. The antidote starts with the capacity for expression, the ability to translate the invisible into form, word, gesture, or art. According to Jung, the unexpressed symbol tends to become an autonomous agent within the psyche, acting as a foreign body that has not been digested by consciousness. The only way to integrate these internal images is to offer them a contour in the external world. Symbolic expression, whether through art, writing, music, or rituals, is not an aesthetic luxury. Rather, it is a necessary necessity for the psychic. Survival of the intuitive introverted type. What separates the imaginative visionary from the disjointed mystic is this act of converting the symbol into the real. The intuitive introverted type turns their symbolic isolation into impact, their oddity into language, and their solitary into conversation when they manage to externalize their perceptions. What started off as an internal maze turns into a shareable map, and this production process has two outcomes. History is replete with instances of people who most likely functioned from this intuitive, introverted function. And it not only releases internal psychological tension, but also provides communal access to materials that were previously solely in the unconscious. Franz. Through his intricate and surreal writings, Kafka expressed his symbolic alienation in pieces that continue to depict the ridiculousness of contemporary life. Not being able to adjust to the practical world, Van Gogh poured his emotional and symbolic vision into explosive brushstrokes. Each painting was a desperate attempt to translate a boiling soul. Even Jung, who recognized this type in himself, wrote his deepest works as attempts to translate complex internal experiences into comprehensible systems. However, these examples demonstrate that symbolic expression is the bridge that connects the inner and outer worlds. When this bridge is absent, the symbol builds up and closes in on itself, distorting reality. However, when there is a way out, the inner image becomes a work gesture word, which reorganizes the psyche, and the intuitive function stops working in the dark and starts working with consciousness. The intuitive introverted type by nature tends to ignore the body routine and concrete limits, which exposes them to new risks. Therefore, creativity is not just a gift, it is a process of psychological integration. However, even the most elaborate, symbolic expression may not be sufficient if it lacks a foundation in reality. Creating may become into an obsession, and inspiration can turn into an escape. We'll look at this crucial component in the next section, along with how fundamental, earthly and bodily activities could operate as a buffer against psychological collapse. Only when intuition is balanced by sense can the symbol also find a sensory ground, resulting in true integration. If what you're hearing resonates with you, my booklet is truly valuable. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's fundamental ideas and gives you tools to help you better understand who you are. The pinned comment contains the URL. The intuitive function operates outside of time, the body, and linearity, particularly in its introverted form. Symbols and premonitions are gathered as it sinks into the unconscious, and visions that are not a part of the physical world appear. Jung emphasized the importance of integrating the inferior function sensation because this intuition has the potential to become a whirlpool without an anchor and a solid foundation in the present. This ability is what gives the introverted intuitive type its mysterious brilliance, but it is also what weakens it. We are connected to the present, our bodies, and the material world through the sense of sensation, which perceives what is tangible. To the introverted intuitive, who frequently dismisses these perceptions as trivial or unimportant, the weight of an object in the hands, the bitter taste of coffee, or the warmth of the sun on the skin all seem like foreign languages. However, it is precisely this language that can offer the remedy for excessive abstraction. The materiality of everyday activities like walking, cooking, tending to plants, doing a handcraft, or just sticking to a schedule provides balance for this type. Symbolic depth is maintained rather than diminished by the return to the body, routine, and the present. Their visions cease to be labyrinths and become roots when the type can switch between intuitive diving and concrete practice, allowing them to navigate between the unseen and the tangible, the internal and the outward. This passage exemplifies true psychological development. The symbol then transforms from a passive object of contemplation into a real guiding principle that affects interpersonal interactions and life choices. Not as an oracle, but as a compass. In this environment, daily routines take on a therapeutic significance. They don't have to be complex or esoteric. They can be as basic as lighting a candle in the morning, journaling at the end of the day, or intentionally organizing a workplace. The unconscious is told by these insignificant movements that there is order, a body and reality, and that the symbol can come down to earth in this ritualized place without exploding the psyche. They also establish an axis in the internal chaos. The final obstacle for the introverted intuitive type is to live their truth in a society that generally rejects everything that cannot be measured, explained, or monetized, even with symbolic expression and real-world anchoring. This is due to the fact that intuition is strengthened, not limited, by the integration of feeling. How to stay true to their vision in a world where promptness, productivity, and reason are paramount. How to continue to perceive internal cues when the external environment is determined to follow the concrete. The final portion of the video will focus on this ultimate conflict. Maintaining their inner truth in a society that continuously rejects the invisible, modern culture that is focused on the tangible, immediate and quantifiable values is a challenge that few people see, even when the intuitive, introverted type develops symbolic expression and anchoring techniques. Objective results, productivity of visible performance and statistical data, deep intuitions. In addition to being ignored, symbolic visions and silent reflections are sometimes ridiculed, pathologized, or dismissed as unimportant by the intuitive introverted person. This creates an ongoing conflict between their need to adapt and their loyalty to their own soul. Whenever they are forced to choose between staying true to who they are, even if it means being marginalized, misunderstood and lonely, or betraying their inner vision to fit into the mainstream conversation. This decision isn't theoretical, rather it shows up in the facts of everyday life, in conversations where they have to keep their true thoughts to themselves, in situations where their silence is seen as weakness, or in jobs where they can't say what they see, feel, or sense for fear of being judged as improper. Resignation is not necessarily the outcome of this tension, though. According to Jung, individuation necessitates precisely this, maintaining the symbolic core of the self in the face of opposing collectivist forces while living one's symbolic truth. For the intuitive introverted person, this means navigating through the world without losing their internal axis, even though they are aware that their vision may never be fully realized. This is because intuition's ultimate purpose is to point to paths that do not yet exist, not to persuade or win people. Living symbolically in a materialistic society is a silent act of resistance. It is prioritizing meaning over convenience and depth over appearance. If you feel like you belong to this invisible world, or if you live among symbols, intuitions, and premonitions that few understand, share in the comments how you have dealt with this crossing. What strategies have you found to remain whole And how do you balance the inner world with the external reality? For example, this type becomes a transformative figure when they find the courage to stay true to what they see, not by imposing themselves on the world, but by revealing with their presence that there is something beyond the surface. And this revelation, no matter how subtle, has the power to touch, disturb, and inspire those who are willing to perceive. Others may find your response useful if they are dealing with the same silent problem. Furthermore, don't forget to watch the following video, which may be the logical progression of this thought and offer the final component needed to delve even farther. I'm hoping to run across you there.